Unknown planets, legendary battles, and incredible stories await you here. But don't forget to be a part of this universe. Subscribe, like, comment, be a part of this great adventure. Darkness stretched infinitely beyond the curved glass of the command deck. Stars burned cold and distant, scattered like forgotten embers in an endless void. The Erebus drifted through space, a lone vessel against the silent pull of the abyss. The hum of its core was steady, reassuring, like a heartbeat, but beneath it, tension crackled, unseen yet unmistakable. Captain Elena Voron stood at the center of the deck, arms crossed, gaze locked onto the holographic display flickering before her. The readings were worse than expected. Perseus 9 was still there, barely, a dim beacon in the heart of a region no species dared to enter. The black hole clusters, a graveyard of ships, a void from which nothing returned. And yet, 10 years ago, humans had settled there. The colony had thrived at first, expanding beneath the glow of an unstable sun. 4 years, messages had arrived. Scientific reports, supply requests, routine updates. Then they had slowed. He was broad-shouldered, sharp-eyed, and carried an air of relaxed competence. Useful in a crisis, infuriating otherwise. Translation: this is a very bad idea. Elena turned to face him. You knew that before we left. Rains grinned. Yeah, but I was hoping you'd come to your senses before we reached the point of no return. Elena didn't smile. That point was 3 days ago. Commander Lien Ortega, their navigator, leaned over her console, frowning at the readings. Sayer, can you confirm any life signs on Perseus 9? The AI hesitated again. That was never a good sign. There are irregularities. Define irregular, Ortega pressed. Energy fluctuations consistent with artificial sources. Faint biological signatures. Unstable atmospheric readings. The planet's orbit has shifted. Elena's jaw tightened. A planet's orbit didn't shift without cause. Dr. Felix Arendt, their lead scientist, rubbed his temples. The gravitational forces here should have torn everything apart. I mean, it disappeared. No lingering signal. No trace. Elena exhaled slowly. Pull the data fast. Arendt's fingers danced over the console, bypassing security that should have been impossible to breach so easily. It was as if the system wanted him inside. Files unlocked with little resistance. Strings of fragmented logs scrolling past in jagged bursts. Then, abruptly, a playback initiated. A recording. Fuzzy at first, distorted by whatever interference had tainted this place. Then, a voice. If anyone hears this, do not respond. Do not speak. Do not acknowledge them. They know when you listen. They know. Static swallowed the rest. Silence. A deep, unnatural silence. Then, from somewhere beyond the colony walls, a sound broke through. A slow, deliberate knock. Elena turned sharply, pulse hammering. The others had heard it too. Knocking. 3 times. Rhythmic. Measured. Not the wind. Not debris. Something was out there. Not in the traditional sense. He paused, struggling for the right words. Reality itself is degrading. Something altered the fundamental structure of this place. The gravitational inconsistencies, the distortions, the shadows moving when they shouldn't, it's all connected. Rains let out a slow breath. Great. So we're standing in a broken reality. Fantastic. Elena ignored him. Anything useful? Arendt pulled up an audio log, static crackling through the speakers. A man's voice, strained and hoarse, played through the distortion. We saw them again. Not people. Not anymore. They wear our faces. Whisper in our voices. But they are not us. The tower, static. It is watching. Learning. We let it in. Now. The recording cut off. A long silence followed. Ortega spoke first. Well, that's horrifying. Elena's mind worked through the implications. The colonists had let something in. Something that could mimic them. Something that could learn. Arendt, pale and silent, tapped furiously at his wrist display, pulling data from the colony's corrupted network. The moment they stepped into the building, the pressure outside lessened, just enough for Elena to feel it, like surfacing from deep water. The lights inside remained dim, flickering as if fighting against an unseen force. The console still hummed, waiting, the last distorted frames of the woman frozen on the screen. Elena turned to Arendt. "Tell me you got something." He didn't look up. "Not enough." She exhaled, forcing down frustration. "Define not enough." "The system is deteriorating. Logs are fragmented. Data is corrupted. But the anomaly is everywhere, woven into their last transmissions, sensor readings, even personal logs. Something infected this colony before it went silent." His fingers moved faster, scrolling through fragmented code. "And it's still here." Ortega frowned. "What do you mean infected?" Arendt hesitated. "It's not a virus." "We wait still." Arendt's breathing was shallow. "The colony didn't die. It was rewritten." The woman took another step forward, her limbs jerking in a grotesque mimicry of movement. The knocking continued, no longer hers alone. It came from the walls, the floors, the very structure of the tower. The entire place was alive. "We're leaving," Elena said. She turned toward the way they had come, but it was gone. The chamber was folding. The walls melted into darkness, the exit replaced by an abyss. The tower wasn't going to let them go. "Elena," Ortega's voice was tight, "tell me you have a plan." The woman stepped closer. Then, something shifted. Not in the tower. In Elena. A thought surfaced, not her own, yet familiar. The tower does not kill. It consumes. It becomes. That's why the knocking continued. The colonists weren't dead. They were still knocking, still trying to be heard, even after they had ceased to be themselves. And then, the footage cut out. Arendt exhaled shakily. That was a knock. Loud. Close. Elena moved to the doorway, weapon raised. Ortega and Rains flanked her, stepping carefully into the open street. Nothing. The air remained unervingly thick, the landscape twisted by wrongness they couldn't define. Then, a voice. Distant. "Help us." Ortega stiffened. That wasn't from the comms. Elena's grip tightened around her weapon. "No, it wasn't. Help us." The voice was layered, fractured. Not one, but many, overlapping and stretching, as if distorted by distance. No, by something else. Arendt's hands clenched into fists. "We need to leave." Elena didn't argue. Rains had already moved toward the exit, but as he stepped outside, he froze. Elena followed his gaze, and saw it. A figure stood in the colony square. Still. Watching. The same woman from the footage. Her hollow eyes met Elena's across the distance. Empty. Searching. Then she raised a hand. And knocked. And then, without warning, they had ceased entirely. Probes had been sent. Their signals had vanished into the dark. Search teams had followed, only to be swallowed whole. No distress calls. No debris fields. Just silence. The galaxy had come to a quiet conclusion. Perseus, 9, was lost. Elena disagreed. Her fingers drummed once against the console before she turned to the ship's AI, Sayer, its digital form pulsing faintly in the air beside her. "Report." "Final approach in 48 minutes, Sayer said, its voice smooth but edged with urgency. "Gravitational anomalies increasing. Hull integrity remains within safety parameters. Marginally." Elena exhaled sharply. "Marginally." A beat of simulated hesitation. "The ship is built for extreme conditions. But extreme has layers. We are reaching the upper limit of acceptable risk." Lieutenant Darius Rains let out a low whistle from his station. "Ooh. 3." The exact rhythm they had heard since entering the colony. Rains took a step back. "Captain." Then, the knock came again. Not from the footage. From behind them. Something was there. Moving. Watching. The whisper returned, louder now, layered, shifting between voices. We waited. The tower groaned. The walls breathed. And the knocking did not stop. It only grew louder. Faster. The colonists on the screen were still smiling. Still knocking. And as the footage played, one of the things, turned its head too far, the movement unnatural, wrong. Its mouth opened. The footage cut out. The chamber went dark. And then, the knocking was everywhere. The knocking was everywhere. It reverberated through the chamber, the walls, the air itself. A sound without a source, yet all-encompassing, as though reality had taken up the rhythm and refused to let it stop. Elena's pulse pounded against her ribs. Elena turned sharply to the terminal, ignoring the figure approaching. This wasn't a computer. It was something else. The tower's heart. And every system, no matter how alien, had a failsafe. Elena, what are you doing? Ortega demanded. Ending this. Her fingers moved over the console, instinct guiding her. The symbols weren't meant for human understanding, yet they arranged themselves in a pattern her mind could grasp. A command. A way to sever the connection. A way to stop the knocking. The woman froze. The entire tower reacted. A deep, resonant tremor ran through the walls, the knocking staggering, no longer rhythmic, but erratic, broken. The woman's face twisted, her too wide smile faltering. And then she screamed. Not a sound. A feeling. A wave of something vast and ancient and furious ripped through the air, pressing into their skulls, shoving against the edges of reality itself. Elena pushed the final sequence. The tower fractured. It had no face, no defining features, just a dark outline against the flickering sky. Its edges wavered, indistinct. It didn't move. But Elena felt it watching. And then, it raised a hand, and knocked. Not on the tower. On nothing. 3 times. The same sound. The same deliberate rhythm. The echo vibrated through the colony, through them, as if striking something fundamental beneath their skin. Elena's breath caught in her throat. Then, the figure twitched. A flicker, a distortion, like static on an old screen. And it was closer. Elena's instinct screamed. Fall back. Now. Ortega fired first, the shot ripping through the space where the figure stood, except it didn't connect. The energy dispersed like it had struck water, rippling outward, absorbed. The figure twitched again. And stepped forward. The ground beneath them cracked. Elena grabbed Arendt, hauling him back as the dust beneath their feet shifted, the terrain itself unstable. And yet, every instinct in Elena's body told her they weren't meant to be here. She adjusted the seal on her helmet, hearing the soft hiss as the suit's filtration system activated. Around her, the team moved in disciplined precision, stepping onto the hardened soil of Perseus 9 for the first time. The ground was cracked, dry, though it shouldn't have been. This planet had once been rich with groundwater, its surface threaded with rivers fed by subterranean reservoirs. But now, the earth was parched, veins of black dust webbing outward in jagged fractures. Elena turned, sweeping her gaze across the landscape. The colony stood silent, its structures eerily intact but altered. The angles were subtly wrong, as if something had taken the original design and twisted it into an imitation just imperfect enough to unsettle the human eye. Buildings leaned at odd inclinations. Walkways sloped downward where they should have been level. I hate ghost towns, he muttered, voice barely audible through the comms. Even the real ones don't feel this dead. Keep moving, Elena ordered, advancing toward the colony's main square. The others followed, their boots kicking up dust in the stillness. The deeper they went, the more unnatural it became. The air temperature fluctuated subtly but noticeably, a few degrees up, then down, then up again, as if the planet couldn't decide what season it was. The shadows stretched too long against the walls, bending in ways that had nothing to do with the position of the sun. Some doors stood ajar, but the spaces beyond them were veiled in darkness too thick to be natural. Then there was the sound, or rather, the lack of it. No wind, no rustling of debris, no hum of electrical systems. The silence wasn't mere absence, it was hollow, devouring even the noise of their own movements. Their footsteps felt muffled, their breathing shallow. Rains fought the controls, sweat beating at his temple. Feels like the planet wants us off. Elena gripped the railing as the ship bucked beneath her. Below, Perseus 9 came into view. Or what was left of it. The colony had been designed in precise modular patterns, rows of habitat domes and research stations, interconnected by tunnels and transport routes. But what lay beneath them now was wrong. The structures were intact but skewed, as if reality itself had warped around them. Buildings leaned at unnatural angles. Streets curved where they should have been straight. Entire sections of the colony looked as if they had been dragged, stretched like melted wax. The ship's scanners flickered erratically. Biological readings pulsed and vanished, as if whatever was down there was phasing in and out of existence. And at the heart of it all, something new. A tower. It hadn't been in the original blueprints. Black and seamless, its surface swallowed the light around it. There were no markings, no signs of construction, no entrances visible from this distance. Just a presence. It was wrong in a way the human brain wasn't meant to process. The Erebus touched down with a final, violent shudder. Silence followed. Elena rose from her seat, pulse steady, mind racing. She glanced at Ortega, then at Rains, then back at the display where the strange tower loomed. "Suit up," she ordered. "We find the colonists. We find out what happened. And then we leave." Rains checked his weapon. Preferably in that order. Outside, the air shimmered, not with heat, but with something else. Something unseen. Elena stepped forward. And the shadows moved. The air outside was wrong. Not toxic, at least, not in the conventional sense, but thick, weighted, as if the atmosphere itself carried an unspoken warning. The scanners had detected oxygen, nitrogen, the usual components of a breathable sky. But something is still functioning. That defies, he stopped himself. Logic. Elena finished for him. Good. Then we're right where we belong. Rains muttered something under his breath but started prepping the descent sequence. The Erebus wasn't designed for landings. It was a deep space research vessel, reinforced for high radiation zones and gravitational turbulence, but planetary descent, especially in a system warped by black holes, was not in its primary functions. The ship's thrusters were powerful, but landing was dangerous. Taking off again? Even worse. As they began their descent, turbulence hit like a hammer. The ship shuddered as unseen forces pressed against it, warping metal, twisting reality itself. Lightning arced through the clouds, but there was no storm, just raw energy twisting in unnatural patterns. "Sayer!" Ortega shouted over the shaking. Adjusting stabilizers. The AI responded. Atmospheric density is inconsistent. Wind currents are fluctuating. Elena gestured toward the nearest building, an administrative complex judging by the faded insignia above the door. Arendt, see if you can pull any data from inside. Ortega, secure the perimeter. Arendt stepped forward, cautiously, his gloved hand hovering over the access panel. The colony's power grid should have been long dead, but as he reached for the controls, the panel flickered to life. A single, blinking cursor appeared on the screen. Then text, scrawled in a language no human had ever written. "What the hell is that?" Rains murmured. Arendt inhaled sharply. "It's not any known code. Not human, not AI generated." He hesitated. "It's reacting to us." As if in answer, the building's internal lights flared for half a second, then cut out. A low vibration rippled through the ground beneath them. Elena raised her weapon instinctively, scanning the shadows. "Report." "Sensors just spiked," Ortega snapped. "Brief energy surge." "Gone now." "Define gone," Elena said. Streetlights flickered with no discernible source of power. And then, of course, there was the tower. It loomed at the colony's center, impossibly dark, its surface absorbing every trace of light. Even from a distance, Elena could feel it pressing against the edges of her thoughts, like a whisper she couldn't quite hear. The structure hadn't been in the original blueprints. It hadn't existed the last time anyone had sent a transmission from Perseus 9. And yet, there it was, rooted in place as if it had always belonged. A voice crackled in her ear. "Still no movement," Ortega reported, her tone clipped, wary. She stood near the outskirts of the landing zone, rifle raised, scanning the buildings with keen, tactical precision. No response to our signals. No heat signatures beyond environmental distortions. Whatever's left here, it's not showing itself. Elena nodded once. That was expected. It didn't make her feel any better. Rains, standing beside her, gave a slow exhale. "You hate most places," Ortega muttered. "Yeah, but this one feels like it hates me back." Elena exhaled. "Rains, check the perimeter." He hesitated just long enough to earn a raised brow from her before muttering under his breath and heading toward the exit. The moment he stepped outside, the temperature seemed to drop, not enough to be lethal, but enough for the suit's environmental sensors to register a sudden, unnatural dip. The colony remained still. The air pressed against him, thick with something unseen. He took slow, measured steps, scanning the area, his weapon primed. His HUD flickered briefly, a momentary distortion in his visor display that disappeared before he could react. Then, his proximity sensors spiked. Behind him. He turned fast, aiming at nothing. No movement. No figure lurking in the shadows. But the darkness had shifted. The angles of the buildings, the way the shadows bent, it had changed in a way his mind struggled to register. Like looking at a picture that had been subtly altered, but he couldn't pinpoint how. His radio crackled. "Report." Rains swallowed. "No movement, but—" He hesitated. "Something feels off." A beat of silence, then Elena's voice, firm and unshaken. "Return to the building." He didn't need to be told twice. He turned back, moving quickly, but as he reached the entrance, something caught his eye. A footprint in the dust. Not his. Not recent. Something old, but unmistakably human. He forced himself forward, stepping back inside just as the monitors on the console flared to life. Ortega swore under her breath, her weapon rising instinctively. "That's new." Arendt leaned over the console, his fingers flying across the controls. The screens flickered, static distorting the images before settling into grainy security footage. The colony square, captured from an overhead feed. Elena narrowed her eyes. "Rewind." Arendt complied, scrubbing back through the corrupted footage. And it was letting them know. The knocking stopped. Elena remained still, every muscle taut, listening for whatever came next. But there was nothing. No scuttling of movement. No distant hum of failing machinery. Just the suffocating weight of a silence too deliberate, too complete. Outside, the colony stretched before them, abandoned yet not empty. The dim glow of Perseus IX's dying sun barely reached past the jagged rooftops, casting elongated shadows that pooled unnaturally along the cracked streets. Shapes stretched and twisted as if the light itself struggled to behave the way it should. Ortega kept her rifle high, her breathing steady. "That wasn't the wind," she said, voice low, as if afraid to disturb the quiet. "No," Elena agreed. "It wasn't." Her mind raced through possibilities. An automated system malfunctioning? A natural geological shift? But there was no wind, no tremor. The knocking had been intentional. Rains shifted uneasily. "I really hate places like this." Once. Twice. 3 times. The same pattern. The same slow, deliberate motion. Then she flickered, like an image struggling to hold itself together. And vanished. The echoes of the knocks lingered, reverberating in the air long after she was gone. And this time, the silence felt like something alive. The silence thickened. Not an absence of sound, but a presence in itself. Pressing, listening, waiting. Elena's breathing was slow, controlled. Her pulse steady despite the creeping sense that something unseen had shifted around them. The woman. No, the thing was gone, but the weight of her stare lingered. She lowered her weapon but didn't holster it. Back inside. Now. No one argued. The team moved quickly, retracing their steps through the warped colony streets, boots crunching against brittle ground. Ortega scanned their surroundings with quick, sharp movements, her jaw tight. Rains kept his rifle raised, his usual levity absent. The screen glitched, flickered, and then, a figure. A blur at the edge of the frame. Elena stepped closer. Pause. Enhance. The image sharpened just enough to reveal the outline of a person. Human in shape. But wrong. Its edges were blurred, indistinct, as if reality itself was resisting its presence. The figure stood unmoving in the colony's center, its posture stiff, unnatural. Then, suddenly, the footage distorted again. The image glitched, static erupted across the screen. Then, for a split second, the face sharpened. A woman. Elena felt her breath hitch. The eyes were hollow, the mouth slightly open as if caught mid-whisper. The uniform was worn, faded, but the insignia was clear. One of the original colonists. Or what was left of her. Then, without warning, she turned. Not a normal turn. A sharp, unnatural movement, as if something had yanked her sideways in an instant. One frame she faced the camera, then she was simply somewhere else. She turned back to the screen, eyes narrowing at the tower's silhouette in the corrupted footage. It hadn't been there before. She had read every report, memorized every blueprint. The colony had been designed with strict efficiency, research hubs, living quarters, supply stations. No such structure had ever existed in the original plans. And yet, there it was, solid and undeniable. The colonists had built it. Or she swallowed. Or it had built itself. Reins shifted uneasily. Captain, I know you like a good mystery, but maybe this is the part where we don't investigate the creepy void tower? Ortega ignored him, glancing at Elena. If the colonists were studying this thing, there has to be a central data hub. Something physical. If we can find it, we might get answers. Elena nodded. Then that's our next move. Reins groaned. Of course it is. The trip through the colony was worse this time. Her team followed, their suit lights cutting through the suffocating dark. Their beams illuminated the walls. Smooth, perfect, stretching upward into infinity. Space here was wrong. The structure bent in ways the eye couldn't process, corridors forming and unforming as if the tower itself were shifting around them. Elena tapped her helmet. The comms flickered static. No signal. They were alone in here. Ortega swept her light forward, revealing a corridor that hadn't been there moments ago. It stretched deep into the tower, impossibly straight. Elena signaled for them to move. As they advanced, the wall seemed to tighten around them, not visibly, but perceptibly. One moment the passage stretched far ahead, the next, it felt closer, as if the space behind them had folded inward, leaving them with only one direction. Reins muttered under his breath. This place is alive. They kept moving. The corridor led to an open chamber, circular and vast. Elena felt its presence like a pressure at the base of her skull, as though the structure itself was aware of their approach. Her HUD flickered again, unable to stabilize a reading. The tower's dimensions wavered, shifting in impossible increments. One moment it was towering distant. The next, it was right there, the void of its surface stretching impossibly high above them. Ortega let out a slow exhale. This thing doesn't want to be understood. Elena agreed. But they had come for answers, and those answers were inside. She turned to Arendt. Find us a way in. He hesitated, then stepped forward. His gloved fingers hovered near the surface of the structure before pressing against it. The moment he made contact, the world shuddered. A vibration rippled outward from his touch, waves distorting the surface like liquid disturbed by an unseen force. Then, without a sound, the material vanished. Not a door, not a seam, just absence. A perfect, gaping void had replaced the wall, an angular wound in reality itself. Arendt stumbled back. That's not, he stopped, shook his head. That's not normal. Reins clicked the safety off his rifle. Nothing here is. Elena took a breath and peered into the darkness beyond. No readings. No movement. Her HUD still refused to map the space inside, as if the interior simply did not exist until they stepped into it. She glanced back at the others. We go in together. No one strays. Ortega adjusted her grip on her rifle. Wouldn't dream of it. With a final breath, Elena stepped forward. The moment she crossed the threshold, the world went silent. No comms chatter. No hum of the suit's environmental filters. The silence wasn't just an absence of sound. It was a void, pressing against her eardrums, swallowing even the noise of her own breathing. She turned, but the entrance had already sealed behind them. The air folded around them, bending, twisting, as if the space between their bodies and the tower was shrinking, collapsing. Rain swore. Captain! Another step. The air ripped. A sound unlike anything they had ever heard. Deep, resonant, like something vast and ancient breathing in. Elena's vision blurred. Then, Everything snapped back. The figure was gone. The silence returned, thick and stifling. The team stood at the colony's edge, disoriented, breathless. And the tower loomed before them, unchanged. Ortega was the first to speak, voice hoarse. What the hell was that? Arendt's hands were shaking. We shouldn't be here. Elena swallowed hard. But her eyes stayed locked on the tower. It was waiting. And now, it knew they were coming. The tower loomed before them, an anomaly of black stone and unknowable intent. It did not stand against the sky. It consumed it, bending light, warping perception. The temperature fluctuated more erratically, rising and dropping by impossible degrees. The structures around them felt different. Walls seemed subtly closer, pathways slightly altered, like the entire colony was shifting in ways just beyond perception. The wind had returned, but it carried no sound. The air crackled with the hum of something unseen. Then, just as they neared the tower, Ortega stopped. Wait! The others froze. She crouched, running a gloved hand over the ground. It took Elena a moment to register what she was looking at. Footprints. A trail, half buried in the dust, leading toward the tower. And they weren't alone. A second set walked alongside them, not identical, but close. Almost a perfect match, but subtly wrong. A fraction of a step off, slightly elongated, as if stretched mid-stride. Ortega straightened. Captain. Elena followed her gaze. Ahead of them, at the base of the tower, something stood waiting. Not the woman this time.
Something taller.
Her visor display flickered erratically, data failing to register. The air inside the tower thickened, charged with something unseen, something waiting. Then, silence. Total. It lasted less than a second, but in that moment, she knew. It was here. A shape stirred in the darkness beyond the failing glow of their suit lights. No footsteps, no breath. Just movement, a shifting of space. Ortega swung her rifle toward it, but the light revealed nothing. A void within a void. Then, a voice, whispering, layered, wrong. You are not them. Elena felt it inside her head, an intrusion pressing against her thoughts, wrapping around them like cold hands. The others reacted too. Ortega tensed, Arendt stumbled back, Rains let out a sharp breath. The shadows pulsed, and the knocking resumed. Faster. The chamber walls shuddered as if something massive pressed against them. The air contracted, closing in like the tower itself was inhaling. Elena! Arendt's voice was raw, urgent. The only feature was a black, monolithic structure rising from the floor. A console, if it could be called that. It pulsed faintly, its surface shifting in ways that defied logic, reflecting the team's lights in unnatural patterns. Elena stepped closer. Arendt hesitated, then extended a hand toward the pillar. The moment his fingers touched it, the hum deepened, low, resonant, reverberating through the chamber. And then, a whisper. Not through the comms. Not in their ears. Inside their heads. You are not them. Ortega's breath hitched. I hate that. Arendt's fingers trembled on the console. It's old. Older than the colony. Older than us. The whispers continued, overlapping, bleeding into one another, shifting between voices. They welcomed us. Opened the door. We learned. We waited. Arendt's wrist console activated on its own, data spilling across the screen in unreadable symbols. Then, an image. Footage. The colonists. Not dead. Not entirely. The video was grainy, distorted, but it showed them standing in this very chamber. Ill. Eyes hollow. Faces slack. Not afraid. Not in pain. Just waiting. Then as one they turned. Looked directly at the camera. And smiled. Ortega swore and stepped back. Nope. Absolutely not. Rains let out a sharp breath. That is so much worse than dead. Elena clenched her jaw. The colonists weren't gone. They weren't missing. They were still here. Changed. Altered. Used. The footage flickered. One of the figures twitched, the movement wrong, a delay between intent and action. Then, a knock. Elena's breath caught. Not from behind them. Not from the walls. From inside. Ortega's grip tightened on her weapon. Did that just... Another knock. Louder. This time, the sound vibrated through the air itself, as if striking something unseen. Then, movement. The footage on the console changed. The colonists, still smiling, began to knock. In unison. Slow. Deliberate. 1. The colony was still a graveyard, but the thing inside it, the thing that had become the colonists, was no more. She activated her comm. Erebus, this is Voron. Static. Then. Captain. Sayer's voice. Sharp. Urgent. We lost your signal. What happened? Elena's eyes stayed on the empty crater. Mission complete, she said. A pause. Then, softly. Returning home. We have to go. She didn't need convincing. Elena now. Ortega grabbed her arm, but Elena was already moving. That thing is inside the walls. The chamber shifted. The doorway they had entered through no longer existed. The path behind them had folded away, leaving only one exit, a narrow corridor leading deeper inside. A choice made for them. No time to argue. Elena sprinted forward, the team following. Their boots pounded against the sleek floor, but their footfalls sounded wrong, delayed, like echoes trailing half a second behind. Then the walls moved. Not just shifting, closing. Elena! I see it. They ran harder. The corridor narrowed with every step. The light from their suits barely cut through the dark, revealing only the ever-tightening passage ahead. The air pressed in, dense with something not meant to be seen. Then, open space. They spilled into another chamber, their momentum staggering them forward. This one was larger, emptier. In its center stood a massive terminal, its surface pulsing with unreadable symbols. And before it, a figure. Elena stopped short, chest heaving. A woman, or what had once been one. She wore the colony's insignia on a faded jumpsuit, her limbs too rigid, her posture too still. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, her eyes wide, empty, seeing too much and nothing at all. She opened her mouth and knocked 3 times. The walls trembled with the impact. Then she twitched. A sharp, unnatural motion, as if something inside her had jerked her body like a puppet. She stepped forward, movement staggered, fragmented. Elena, Rains muttered. Elena raised her rifle. The woman smiled. Behind her, the terminal flared, symbols shifting into something readable. A message. A warning. They are not dead. They are not alive. They are not themselves. A new voice filled the chamber. Not the woman's. Something through her. They welcomed us. Opened the door. We learned. We waited. Light erupted from the console, spreading outward, tearing through the walls. The woman convulsed, her form unraveling, dissolving into strands of something that had never been flesh at all. The knocking stopped. The walls collapsed. The last thing Elena saw was the tower splitting apart, breaking free of itself. Then, light. The ground beneath her boots was solid. The sky above was open. They were outside. The tower was gone. A crater remained where it had stood, its presence erased as if it had never existed. The air felt cleaner, lighter. The weight pressing against their bones was gone. Ortega staggered forward, staring at the empty space. Did we? Rains let out a breathless laugh. We're alive. That's all I care about. Arendt collapsed to his knees, hands shaking. They're gone. All of them. Not dead, but gone. Elena inhaled deeply, her first real breath in what felt like hours.